Hello everyone, Mewtwo Overkill here. Today we're going to be doing a somewhat different deck profile. We are going back in time, as you can see with the band card here. We are going back in time to 2004, just before Invasion of Chaos dropped, and Cookie Cutter Chaos was the deck to play. I like this deck. It just takes things back to a simpler time. I'm building 2 copies of this deck to mirror with people. I actually prefer this over Goat Control for, I like Goat Control. I haven't played it as much as Yata-Garasu though, and I just prefer Yata-Garasu. It's just my thing. I feel I'm better with Yata-Garasu than I am with Goat Control. And again, I haven't had as much practice, but anyway. So, back in 2004, when Invasion of Chaos dropped, Black Luster Soldier Envoy at the beginning and Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy at the end were both limited to 1. They signified being able to summon powerful monsters for little to no cost. And the format wasn't, I mean, it was kind of, the format was sackier than Goat Control, but I still have fun with it when I go back to it from time to time. This build, there were a few variations of Chaos. This one is more control-based, but it's still a more basic build. You had sackier Chaos, that was just like Turbo and Sacky, and then you had more control, and then you had decks that followed a more control and stun aspect of Chaos. But a lot of the deck lists ran the same cards. A lot of them ran the same spell lineup, and similar monster lineups, and almost always the same traps. So we'll get into the deck here. Also, one thing I should mention is that at this time in 2004, there were no cards that were forbidden or banned. There was only a limited and semi-limited list. So you had cards like Chaos Emperor Dragon and Yata-Garasu limited to 1. Morphine Jar was actually at 2, believe it or not. Upstart was at 1, I think. Torrential was at 3, believe it or not. And then I can put a link to the ban list I'm using in the description if you want that. If you want to take a look at it. It's on Yu-Gi-Oh! Wikia. So, with that little history lesson out of the way, let's get to the deck. 1 Yata-Garasu. It was restricted to 1 at the time, and you could only... It had no attack, but that didn't matter. Well, it had only 200 attack. But that really doesn't matter, because what this was for was when you cleared your opponent's field and most of their hand, and you were able to summon this and hit them and lock them out of their draw phase for that turn. The only way they could come back from that is if they still had playable cards in their hand, if they haven't had cards in their hand in the first place, or they had a Sinister Serpent in your graveyard that you didn't have an answer to. So, Yata-Garasu, this card is arguably the reason for the Forbidden list. They probably could never bring this back without some sort of errata. 1 Black Luster Soldier Envoy at the beginning. Please forgive the lighting in the shadows. This is really only the good place in the house I can record right now without getting disturbed or disturbing any others. But 1 Black Luster Soldier Envoy at the beginning, and 1 Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy of the end. Black Luster Soldier, these are pretty obvious choices. I will say you didn't run Chaos Sorcerer because you had these cards, and Chaos Sorcerer was just a weaker BLS. So, which of these is more powerful? Arguably it's Chaos Emperor Dragon, but they've errated Chaos Dragon to the point of almost being unplayable, which I really don't like. It kind of ruins their legacy. And, like, they're supposed to be remembered for being these overpowered cards that you can't play anymore. And they should be remembered for what they did back then. They won games, and they were abused. But Emperor Dragon is what got your opponent into the Yata lock most of the time, because you would have Sandgit or Witch on the field. Make sure you haven't normal summoned that turn. Summon Chaos Emperor. Activate its effect to send everything on the field and in both players' hands to the graveyard. Use Witch or Sandgit to search Yata-Garasu, and then summon Yata-Garasu, and then you would proceed to peck them to death, and they can't draw. So unless they had Sinister Serpent in the graveyard, there was no way to get out of the lock, and you basically scoop at that point. So these are the Chaos Monsters of Invasion of Chaos. Well, there is Dark... I will say I don't run Dark Magician of Chaos in this build because it's more toward the Saki build, and believe it or not, people back then thought Dark Magician of Chaos was a little too slow just because you had to tribute 2 monsters for it. And it was also a very risky card, because even if you had your... Dark Magician of Chaos was at 3 at the time, and with its original effect where you got the spell card back right away. But the thing is with Dark Magician of Chaos, if you sent your Dark Magician to the Chaos only to reborn it later, if your opponent got to their reborn first, they could reborn your Dark Magician of Chaos and then reborn something else or use another spell card, and you would be at a huge disadvantage then. So Dark Magician of Chaos is... I'll build a Saki... I'll recreate this deck, do a deck profile of it again with the Sakier build that runs 3 Dark Magician of Chaos just for fun. But this is a more control aspect build, so I would say no Demock if you're playing the... if you want to play for fun, play Demock, but if you want to play with a competitive mindset that they had back then, don't play Dark Magician of Chaos. Your Searchers, Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, Sangan way before the errata. These could literally get you to nearly any low-level monster in your deck. These could also search Yata-Garasu, which could actually search Jinzo, which is pretty cool. And Sangan, your best searchers. Tribe-Infecting Virus and Sinister Serpent. Virus, Walking Raigeki, great synergy with Sinister Serpent with its original effect, because you could pitch it, add it back to your hand, pitch it again. Well, during your standby phase, you add it back to your hand. But this card, Serpent, also has great synergy with cards like Mirage of Nightmare, Graceful Charity, and it's also a good out to Delinquent Duo, because you can just plus back off the duo. One Breaker and the Magical Warrior, and 1 Jinzo. Breaker and Jinzo I like because they're outs to a trap card you'll see later called Imperial Order, which is very debilitating. Jinzo is also a good call the Haunted target. He's a good Painful Choice target. Serpent's a good Painful Choice target, I forgot to mention. Breaker, 1900 was actually pretty big back then with his counter. So you use him to run over stuff. He could run over everything except like Jinzo and stuff that had like 2000 defense and your Chaos Monsters, obviously. But Breaker is good, and also you want to mention that these guys are both darks, so you get your Chaos Monsters just that more quickly. One Reflect Mounter, it's a light and it has a pretty good effect for back then. It was kind of more of a control aspect, like stop your opponent from attacking if they didn't want to take a lot of damage. Double Magician of Faith. The game was a lot slower back then, so Faith was very viable. Not only was the game slower, but you also ran the most broken spell lineup ever in this entire game for any deck in the meta. Because Chaos was really the first most powerful deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! But what Chaos essentially was is you just took all the most powerful cards in the game that were available and just put them together. But Faith, because you ran so many powerful spells... Sorry, I'm rambling in the history lesson. Run Shining Angel. Some people didn't run this. I like it because it recruits your 2 DD Warrior Ladies. DD Warrior Lady was an excellent card for getting rid of... You just ram into a big monster like BLS or Jinzo, take some damage, but then you remove that monster from the game. Double Kaiku, the Ghost Destroyer. You ran this because it's basically the same reason you ran it in spellbooks with the Dragon Ruler format. So your opponent couldn't banish stuff from their graveyard. And when it did damage to your opponent, you got to banish 2 monsters from the graveyard. So this banishes Chaos Fighter from your opponent's graveyard. You banish things like Sangan Witch, Sinister Serpent, Lights. You can just run them out of Chaos Fighter really quickly if they don't have an answer to this. And that's all the monsters. Some monsters you could run also are Cyberjar and Fiberjar and Morphing Jar. Cyberjar was at 1, Fiber was at 1, Morphing was at 2, believe it or not. Probably better suited to the Sakier build, even though Cyberjar is one of my most favorite cards ever made. It really doesn't suit the control aspect all that very well in old school Chaos. Fiberjar is also not bad. But you usually didn't want to... Fiberjar was really only good if you had a bad start. Late game, it wasn't that good because it reset your graveyard. And then Cyberjar was only really good late game if you had a bad start and you had more monsters in your deck than your opponent did. So I opted not to run those in this build, even though Cyberjar is my most favorite card ever. Now we have Painful Choice. Probably the most broken spell card ever created. You take 5 cards from your deck, reveal them all to your opponent picks one, the one they pick gets added to your hand, and the rest gets sent to the graveyard. So this card is essentially 4 Foolish Burials, but it thins your deck by 5 cards. So your Painful Choice targets were usually maybe a Kaiku, a DD Warrior Lady, or Shining Angel, maybe Reflex Bounder, always Jinzo, always Sinister, and always Witcher Sangan. You hardly ever sent spells with Painful Choice, only because you wanted your deck to be thinned and you wanted monsters in the graveyard for you, so that you could dig deeper and get to your Chaos monster that more quickly. For drawing, we had Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, the best 2 draw cards in the game ever made. Well, you could argue that Sixth Sense is pretty good, but it wasn't out at the time. I think it was in the OCG at the time, but not over here. It didn't get released till much later. Graceful, you discard Serpent in a light or a dark that you don't need. Greed, you just draw 2. Upstart was at 1, but people thought Upstart was bad back then, so I'm not running it, even though I probably would, given my knowledge of the game nowadays. One more draw card, Mirage of Nightmare. This card's kind of confusing, so I'll try my best to explain it. It's a continuous spell. During your opponent's standby phase, you draw until you have 4 cards in your hand. Then during your standby phase, you have to discard that many cards randomly that you drew. So you may think that's bad, but back then, being able to turbo through your deck so fast and then just discard so many cards to the graveyard, hopefully you would discard your stuff like your Sinister Serpent and your useless Lights and Darks. But if that didn't happen, you also ran 3 Mystical Space Typhoons to activate during the draw phase, so you could destroy the Mirage of Nightmare and keep your cards. Mirage of Nightmare, or not Mirage of Nightmare, Mystical Space Typhoon is also an out to Imperial Order, because if you activate a spell, then they chain Imperial Order. You can chain the MST from your hand to destroy the Imperial Order and keep activating your spells. Now, I'm going to put these 3 together because it's the Trinity. Delinquent Duo, Confiscation, and the Forceful Sentry. Delinquent Duo, pay 1,000, discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand. One was at random, and they get to pick the second one. Confiscation, pay 1,000, look at your opponent's hand, discard one of their cards. You would usually discard spells with this and not monsters. Delinquent Duo, you really had little control over what they discarded, but it subtracted them by 2 cards, which is still really good. The only thing with Duo is that you wanted them to not have Sinister Serpent in the hand when you activate this. The Forceful Sentry, you look at your opponent's hand and shuffle 1 monster they control in their hand. You shuffle 1 card in their hand back into their deck. Information is always good, and being able to shuffle back a monster that they could use later is also pretty useful. More of the control element. We have a Snatch Steal and a Change of Heart. They're essentially the same card. Snatch Steal is just as powerful as it was when it came off the ban list for a little bit. They won game. You can win games with these. You could take control. Well, with Change of Heart, what's really good about Change of Heart is you could take control of their face-down Magician of Faith, flip it up, take back a spell, then it's an attack mode, so you give it back to your opponent in attack mode, and they basically wasted their Magician of Faith. Snatch Steal, you could take control of things like Blackluster Soldier and Jinzo, Breaker, DD Warrior Lady, Kaiku. Just a great card for turning the tables. Monster Reborn and Premature Burial. These were both at 1 at the time. These cards are pretty self-explanatory. People didn't run Trunade. They didn't even think of it with the loop. Trunade was actually at 3. So if you wanted to loop your Premature Burials, I could probably put that combo in the Sakier build with Demok. But it's a little inconsistent. But it's still very good if you can pull it off. But people didn't even think of running Trunade with Premature Burial at the time, I don't think. And then Monster Reborn is just Monster Reborn. You bring back either one of your monsters or one of your opponent's monsters to your side of the field. More back row destruction. 1 Feather Duster and 1 Heavy Storm. People have debated about these coming back. I think with Twin Twisters at 3 and MST at 3, it's not really necessary. I think they would have to limit some other cards if they brought these back. Of the two, I would say Heavy Storm's a little more fair, even though it gets rid of dead cards in your spell and trap card zone, that like things like Call of the Haunted that sit there. It's also more fair in the Pendulum matchup because you destroy all scales, not just your opponents with Feather Duster. 1 Regeki and 1 Dark Hole. Dark Hole and Regeki were... You may think, well, we have these cards now and they're not that powerful, but this was 2004, where the game was much slower, and these cards had more of an impact on your opponent when you activated them. So for your monster removal spells, you have Regeki and Dark Hole. Now for traps, the most important trap card in the deck, Imperial Order. When you're, while this was on the field, all spell cards are negated that are on the field, which means normal spells get negated too. And then during each of your standby phases, you can choose to pay 700 life points or destroy this card. So it's great for that 1 turn stun. Your opponent activates a spell, you flip this up, they don't have the MST, that spell gets negated. The best thing about this card is that your opponent has to live with it until you decide to turn it off. Amazing card. This card can probably never come back without some sort of crazy errata that makes it unplayable. Damn you, Konami! 1 Call of the Haunted. This card was restricted to 1 at the time. You could bring back your Chaos Monsters if you properly summon them the first time. You could bring back things like Jinzo, DD Warrior Lady. Yata-Garasu was a spirit monster, so it could not be special summoned under any circumstances. You could bring back your Sangan, your tribe-infecting viruses, your Kaikus. Just a very good card. Bringing back stuff from the graveyard back then was a huge deal. 1 Ring of Destruction without the errata, because it didn't have the errata back then. You could end games in a tie if you needed to. You could... It was also just good for blowing up a monster. And you could also go for game with it. With this card alone. This card wins games a lot, actually. 1 Mirror Force. Just a generic board wipe. 1 Torrential Tribute. Another generic board wipe. One thing I should mention is that Torrential Tribute was actually at 3. People only run 1, though. And usually cited the other 2. Because of priority. Now, if you don't know what priority is... Say you summon a monster like Blackluster Soldier Envoy at the beginning that has an ignition effect, the ignition effect where you can banish a monster on the field. If your opponent had a card that could respond to the summon of Blackluster Soldier, like not like something that would negate the summon, but like a Bottomless Trap Hole or a Torrential Tribute, you could choose, before they activate it, you can choose to make the ignition effect of Blackluster Soldier take priority, given there's a valid target, and have it start the chain when your opponent activates Torrential Tribute. What that means is, if your opponent activates Torrential Tribute to the summon of BLS, and BLS activates his effect on summon, they're still going to lose a monster, but BLS will get destroyed, but BLS can still banish a monster on the field. Same thing goes for Chaos Emperor Dragon. That is the Chaos deck. Like I said, this is one of the more basic of builds. There are some other cards you could run, like Magical Scientist. I choose not to run Magical Scientist because I don't own any of the fusions that make him useful. Basically, actually, the only one I'm missing is Thousand Eyes Restrict. So that's basically the entirety of Chaos. The basics. So I basically just given you the basics of Chaos. I really enjoy playing in this format, just because it's what I'm more accustomed to. The more casual aspect and going back to old formats. I'm learning a little bit more about Goat Control as well. I just don't have a Goat deck. One of my friends has the Goat decks. I'm working on building a second copy of this deck so that I can do mirror matches with my friends. And that's really all I have to say about Chaos. If you enjoyed this video, hit it with a like and a comment. And if you're new, consider subscribing. And thank you much for watching. This has been Muto Overkill, and I'll see you all next time. Chaos is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Goodbye, everybody.